Hi everyone and happy Wednesday. I'm happy to report that I am feeling so much better these last few days. I feel like my energy is coming back and I don't feel like I'm in as much of a cloud as I used to be. So I'm feeling very, very thankful and happy about that. And last week when I was having my little painting struggles, I thought to myself, maybe it would have been a good time for me to create neurographic art. But I didn't go down that road, and I sort of wish I had, because neurographic art tends to be so relaxing and so therapeutic for me, and really it would have been a great time for me to create neurographic art. But for whatever reason, my mind just wasn't there, and it may very well be that I wasn't thinking about it because I wasn't feeling 100%. Nevertheless, this week I decided that I am going to focus on creating some neurographic art. I'm going to do it in my own way, as I always do, because I don't tend to really want to adhere to a lot of rules when I'm creating. I find that that can be very hindering for me. And so I'm creating neurographic art. It's gonna look, I think, very different than some of the neurographic art I've created in the past, but I really love how it turned out. So I'm really excited to share this with you, and I hope you'll feel like either painting with me, or if you feel like sitting back and relaxing with me as I paint, I would love to have you along. So let's get going with this week's neurographic art process. Thanks for being here. To get going with my process, I generally like to create a very basic background, and that usually involves creating a light wash of color, and then I sprinkle some salt on top and let it dry. As I hope you can see from the sheen on the paper, there's quite a bit of water on my paper right now. And generally speaking, that's not really much of an issue. I sprinkle a little bit of salt and then I just let it sit and dry naturally for however long it takes. But this time I decided to push things a little bit and I added a lot more salt because I was wondering if that would make a difference. After adding the salt, I will let the paper dry completely and then I'll remove the salt. And even after having removed the salt, it still looks like there's quite a bit of salt on there. The textures are very different than what I normally get. And I'm thinking that this is because I added as much salt as I did. So it turns out that quantity of salt, the quantity of salt that I use when I'm creating my paintings may also be a factor that comes into play. So normally I don't add quite a bit of salt, quite a bit as much salt as I did today, and it seems to create some much different textures. Now, because I love circles, I tend to include them in almost all of my neurographic art pieces. And that's one of the reasons why I started by adding circles to my background. And now I'm just coming in with a clean wet brush and I'm adding some water to each of the circles. And what I'm going to do is just practice some very simple wet on wet paint application. And after I've mixed my colors, I will also add salt to each of my circles. But I'm going to be very mindful of the quantity of salt I'm adding in this case, because I do think quantity matters, or at least it seems so when I look at the background I created. And I think if I only add a little bit of salt to each of these circles, it should create my more usual textures. Here, I'm just doing a side by side to show you an example of a piece of paper where I added far less salt. And you can see that the textures are very different. The middle section of that piece of paper has maybe a little bit less texture, and I think that one of the factors that affected that was also how wet that area was when I added my salt. And you can see looking at them both side to side, there's a lot more texture on the one on the right than there is on the with the one on the left. And the one on the left has more like little speckles. It almost looks like each little granule of salt really left a mark, where you don't really see that with the first one. At this point, I'm getting ready to add my neurographic lines, and before I do that, I want to delineate each of my circles with some black ink just to make them stand out a little bit more, and then I'll add the neurographic lines. For those of you who may not be familiar with the neurographic art process, I'm going to include a list of videos I've created in years past that explain my process in a whole lot more detail. But just to give you a quick rundown of what it is I'm doing when I say I'm creating neurographic lines, is I'm creating these wavy lines throughout my artwork. And what I'm trying to do is not always create the same kind of line, but create areas where the lines are intersecting with each other. So right here, for example, my line that I created not too long ago is intersecting with the line I created around the perimeter of my circle. And that creates an X, and that X has some sharp inner corners. And so the whole process that I follow when I'm doing my own neurographic art is I'm basically rounding off those areas and making them less sharp. There's a reason for this that again is explained in more detail in some of my previous videos. But one of the things I love about doing this is that it's something that really does not require a whole lot of analytical thought, so I can be completely focused on being in the present moment and just um, doing something that's very, very simple. So I don't have to overthink anything about my creative process. I just need to basically find those little areas where the lines are intersecting and turn them into something much more round and smooth. When I'm creating these lines and coloring some of these intersections, I generally love to work with two different tools. One is my fountain pen, which I'm using right now, because it tends to work very well on the rough surface of watercolor paper, and I don't really have to worry about ruining an expensive felt tip marker. So that is one tip I can offer you is generally speaking, working with a metal tip pen works far better on watercolor paper than using a marker because it watercolor paper and if also if you're using salt, we were having this discussion. I was having this discussion with one of our viewers this past week, and they were saying that it really wreaks havoc on their markers, and that is very true. And it's not just about the watercolor paper, but if you're using salt on top of the paper, even if you remove the salt, it leaves a little bit of a residue. And so it will be rougher, a rougher surface for you to color on, and that can really destroy your markers. So if you're like me and other artists and you're very mindful of protecting your tools because they're really expensive, then that's one thing you're going to maybe want to keep in mind. The other tool I love to work with is my brush pen. And one of the reasons I love to work with it is because it can color in some bigger areas much faster than my fountain pen could do it. And because it's a brush, kind of like my other watercolor brushes, it doesn't tend to be affected by the coarse surface of the watercolor paper either. So that tends to be the two tools that I continually turn to when I'm working on neurographic art. Once I'm finished coloring in all of my intersecting lines, I am ready for decorating my art piece. And this for me is where really the sky is the limit. You can do just about whatever you want, especially when you are creating neurographic art with more relaxed rules. The sky, like I said, is the limit. You can just about try anything at all, and generally speaking, it will work really well. So one thing I've never done before when I'm creating neurographic art is come in like I'm doing right now and add some secondary lines. And every single time I create neurographic art, I try to do something a bit different. Unless I really want to replicate what I've done before because I'm creating greeting cards or something like that, I always like to create unique art. And so I'm doing something I haven't done before, and then once I've drawn in all of these lines that I'm creating right now, I'm gonna do something also different from what I've done in the past, and that is add some circles in between these lines. And then I'm going to color in between each of the circles to create some interesting and different shapes within my other shapes. So it's going to make the painting look very different than what I'm used to creating, and this is something I've never done before. So I am kind of excited to give it a try and to create something new. Whether I'm creating neurographic art or painting a landscape or painting an abstract painting, my process is generally very intuitive. And that means that I let my ideas come to me as I'm going along, and then I decide what I'm going to do. Even though I really love what I've created so far, I was kind of feeling like my colors were maybe a little bit more cool and muted than I actually wanted them to be. I wanted to brighten things up a little bit. And so I've decided to bring some opera pink into the mix, and I am going to start with that. And then as I'm building along, with these marks and adding some more color, I'll see what other intuitive nudges come to me. But right now, I'm really liking the addition of this opera pink. It's really bright, it's beautiful, and because I'm applying it in a wash, it is still um, letting us see the textures that are created underneath. And so that's important for me at this part of the process as well. Sometimes I don't mind covering up what I've already created, but I also like creating washes of color that also let what's underneath the layer of color show through as well. And in this case, those little tiny marks that the salt left are interesting to me, and I think they add a little bit to the painting, so I don't want to completely erase them. And by creating a wash, I give them the ability to shine through on these other layers of paint. Another way I love to keep the process more relaxing and fun for me is by keeping it simple when it comes to adding details. So you'll often see me using lines, circles, dots, little swirls, but I generally try to keep it simple. If you know, the more complicated things are, the less relaxing they tend to be. And so when I'm creating neurographic art, it is all about being in the present moment and keeping things very light. And so I am creating some vertical lines here. And again, it's a very simple thing to do. I used a ruler ahead of time to create some guidelines to keep my lines relatively straight, but I'm not stressing about making sure every line is straight. That is not really what I'm trying to do here. I just want to keep it as organic as possible and again, keep it simple. Intuitively, I'm feeling as though something is still missing from my painting, and so I'm going to start working with some iridescent color. This color here is called Ultra Rutile Blue Pearl, and it's a color by Kramer Pigments. I know some of you have mentioned that Kramer Pigments is not available or are not available in your area. If you have access to CSY Art Gallery paints, you can also find an interference blue from their line of paints that works quite well. So I'm going to add this color to my painting, and I am going to do so in just little areas here and there. Like for instance, I'm going to delineate the areas where I created the vertical lines earlier. And as I'm going along, I'll see what else I could add. The reason I felt like reaching for this color to begin adding iridescent color is it has, of course, blue undertones, and most of the painting right now is on the cooler scheme of things. And so I wanted to start first by adding a color or an iridescent paint that was more in line with what was already on the paper. And I think I will dare to do something a little bit more bold after I've done this. But first things first, I'm going to add this, see how I feel, and then decide. I really love the cool undertones in this painting, and in order to make them pop even more, I am going to add some 24 karat Merc gold. And this is going to bring some warmth into the painting that is going to contrast with all of the other cool colors in the painting. And that's going to make everything come alive a lot more. Sometimes when you're not 100% sure with something you're about to attempt on a painting, it's always best to start small and build up. And that's exactly what I did with this painting. I wanted to add the gold. I wasn't 100% sure it was going to work. So I started by adding a little bit, and then once I started to feel like it was really doing what I wanted it to do for the painting, I decided to add more. It is a fine line to walk, that line of between just right and too much. But it's always good to connect with your intuition and see when your body starts to tell you it's time to stop. And for me, that was it. Removing the tape around my border is usually the thing that lets me know whether or not I am truly finished. And I was sort of toying with the idea of adding a little bit of white into the mix of this painting, but really, as I'm removing the tape, I'm feeling like it's perfect exactly the way it is, and I'm loving it, so it's time for me to stop and call it done. With all the colors and the shapes and the movement in this painting, it does have a little bit of a psychedelic feel to it. But it is full of life and it sort of feels like a celebration of the fact that I'm feeling better. So I'm going to go with that. It's a celebration of feeling well and feeling like I have the oomph to create again. For me, neurographic art is generally one of the best ways for me to release the pressure of expectations and just focus on creating mindfully. And when I do so, I find myself more relaxed and I also enjoy my process way more. I hope you found this process equally enjoyable to watch, and even more so, I hope you're feeling inspired to create. Thank you again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating, sweet friends!